Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be showing you an autumnal or fall quilt as you go wall hanging that I made. It is made using orange and black fabrics with some browns and gold and reds, but could easily be adapted to Christmas colors or other seasonal colors. I drew this diagram of the wall hanging so that it would be easier to see the different colors and shapes. I have a photograph of it that I took from online, but this will be much easier to work with. And I figured out if I made the squares 3.5 inches, which would be 3 inches finished, that it would give me an 18-inch square wall hanging. And if I did 4.5-inch squares, I would end up with a 24-inch square wall hanging. I may do 3.5-inch finished squares for a 21-inch square wall hanging. I've laid out all of the orange fabrics that I've gathered from, most of these were from a neighborhood quilt shop. And then I've got some black pieces. I need to look through my bins and find some more black fabric, as well as some more brown fabric if I can find some more. I'll only need 1 or 2 4 or 4.5-inch squares of each fabric. And here are some other fabrics that I may use. I know that I'll be using the red and the golds. So I'm just pulling out everything that I think will look good together. There are some fabric scraps that I have that I really wanted to use in this wall hanging, and this is one of them. I really like this piece of fabric because it has the leaves on it. I didn't necessarily want the turkey and the pumpkin in it, but we're going to make it work. I did have an issue with it not going in the right direction, and so you might want to keep that in mind when you're using fabric that is directional. We ended up having a few pumpkins on their side and an upside down turkey, but that's okay. I'm all right with that. So I'm cutting the squares that I'm going to use for the half square triangles into 4.5 inches. I have this length of fabric that I can use for the backing. However, when I was looking at it, I didn't realize that it was cut into 2 pieces and not folded. But you'll see further on in the video how I fixed that. I'm going to use this brown fabric for the binding, and it's very thin, but for what I'm going to use it for, it will be just fine. This is another scrap piece of fabric that I really wanted to use in this wall hanging, and as I'm measuring it, you can see that it just barely goes into a 4.5-inch square. And so I trim it up, and I have 1 square that I can use out of this fabric. The corner and middle pieces are being cut into 4-inch squares. I normally don't think that spider webs and spiders are cute, but these are. And now back to cutting more 4.5-inch squares for the half square triangles that I need to make. I have stacked the 4.5-inch cut squares into sets of 2s with right sides facing. I have two 4.5-inch squares that I am going to sew together to make 2 half square triangles. So I am marking a center line from corner to corner. I'm using a pen that has ink that disappears with exposure to air, but you could use a regular pen, pencil, or chalk pencil. And you'll see that for the darker fabrics, I use a white chalk pencil. From the center line, I draw a line 1/4 inch to the right, and then I turn the fabric over and do one on the other side. The middle line is my cutting line, and the other 2 lines will be my sewing lines. So I take it to the sewing machine and sew on the 2 outer lines. Back at the cutting mat, and I am just cutting with my rotary cutter down that middle line. And now for the moment of truth. And everything looks really good. I'm just running my fingernail down that seam to open it up and make sure it lays flat. So not to worry, as it seems that I had made 4 of these squares and I had gotten the mates mixed up with them. So now I am just squaring up all of these blocks to make sure that they are all at 4 inches square. So if you've never done this before, it is a pretty important step to making sure that your points match up and that your quilt looks sharp. So this 6.5-inch square is a pretty important tool for me, at least for me, in doing this. I line up the diagonal line and also line it up to be 4 inches, and then I make the cuts or make the trim, and then turn it around to do the other angle. And I'm pretty pleased with how these turned out. I decided that I needed to make another trip to a fabric store to get a few more orange and black fabrics. I was going to try and use the fabrics that I already had exclusively, but I am happy that I made the trip and bought a few extra things to make it more interesting. I just love this little leaf print. I am selecting and cutting the black fabrics now for the middle portion of the wall hanging. And here I am trying to figure out what should go where. You may be wondering where I got the pattern for this, or if there is a pattern or a kit that you can purchase. And at least for me, I am working off a photo that I found online of something that I just really liked. And so I made that pattern out of type paper and just colored in the squares to the colors that I wanted to use for each block. I'm using a lot of what I already had, and it's just, as you can see from this part of the video, it's just a lot of trial and error to find out what looks good next to each other and what suits me. And back to the sewing machine to make half square triangles out of the newly cut squares of fabric that I just purchased. This orange print is another scrap piece of fabric that I really wanted to incorporate into this wall hanging. And I had to piece it together to be able to have enough to make a 4.5-inch square. So I don't know if you can see that seam there or not. I think it looks just fine in the finished product. But I thought that the fabric went together well with the other orange prints, and it was also a scrap piece of fabric from a shirt that I had made in my teenage years. So I've had it for a long time, and this is the last of it. So I was glad that I was able to use that. The good thing about this pattern is that you don't have to be locked into autumnal or fall and Halloween colors with this. It could be stunning done in Christmas colors, reds, greens, whites, or golds. It could be beautiful done in patriotic colors, whatever that looks like for you. It could be beautiful done in pinks, reds, and whites for Valentine's themes, or just done in scrappy fabrics. And here it is all laid out. And after some rearranging and figuring out what I liked and didn't like, this is what I came up with. Now to sew the blocks together into rows, and I am starting with the first row here. These are the second to last and last block of the first row. And now the 2 blocks in the middle of the row. and then sewing those two pieces together. And now sewing the first and second block together, and then eventually that piece to the larger piece that's already sewn. I just love the Civil War prints, and that's what I think this red print is. And I'm just hoping with all the different styles of fabric that I have here, I have some batiks, I have old fabric, new fabric. I just hope that it all works together. I found it pleasing to myself, so I guess that's what matters because I'm keeping it. There's the sideways pumpkin and turkey, and that may bug you, but it doesn't bother me, so I am going to leave it. The maroon and white gingham is fabric that a friend of mine had who has since passed. And so this wall hanging really is a scrapbook of memories for me. I have all of the squares sewn into rows now and pressed with the seams open. I am planning on doing a sew as you go or quilt as you go type pattern with this, but if you wanted to just piece it all together and just have a quilt top, this would be the point at which you would sew all the rows together, and then you would have your pieced top to sandwich together with batting and a backing. I'm just cutting the backing now, and I don't really know what I'm doing, so I don't know what to put on for commentary here. As I said earlier, the piece of fabric was in two pieces, and so it's not quite wide enough or long enough for the width of my wall hanging, and so I am going to sew the two pieces together. And so I take that to the sewing machine and sew a 1/4 inch seam, sewing the two pieces together. Now I am trimming up the fabric that I want to use for the binding because it was not straight. And I'm cutting that into 2.5 inch strips. I then sewed the strips end to end together. I then trimmed off the corners from the back that sewing made and pressed them flat. And then I pressed them vertically in half. I didn't film the process, but I do have a couple of videos that have the entire procedure on it. And then I will also link Jenny Doan's binding tutorial in the description box. So check my description box if you need more detailed instructions. I think that it's so ironic that this is a Halloween wall decoration that I'm making, and I just gathered all different remnants of batting that I had, and I'm sewing together like Dr. Frankenstein's monster. That's what I think of when I look at this piece of batting now. But sewing together pieces works absolutely fine for this project. This is something that's going to be hung on the wall. It's not a quilt. It's not going to be folded and refolded multiple times a day. It's not going to be washed or dried in a dryer or used over people, and so it is perfectly fine to use up your scrap pieces of batting on this. I sewed the pieces flush together using a zigzag stitch. Here are the two pieces of the backing that I sewed together. I just made a seam and opened it up and pressed it, and it will be just fine. Like I said, this is going to be on a wall. People aren't going to be seeing the back at all. And that rhymed. I put the back piece of fabric printed side down on my table and smoothed it out, and then I put Frankenstein's monster, the batting, on top of that and smoothed that out really well. And as you could see, it looked just fine. Nobody's gonna see it from inside. Isn't this little ghost print that I bought at Joann Fabrics just the cutest thing? Sorry, that was a squirrel moment. I laid out all of the rows onto the batting and centered everything. And I am going to start with the two middle rows and put them face side together. And I'm going to stack the other pieces so that I can sew those onto the batting and the backing. I lined up the two middle rows and I pinned down the fourth row, and then I realized that the third row was off a little bit. They didn't quite match up. So you'll see me, I get it all pinned, and then I'll unpin it to take it back to the sewing machine and take in just a little bit on one of the blocks on the third row. Sorry, that's my hair being blown by the fan. So this is the seam that I am going to take in just a fraction so that it will fit better with the row beneath it. So now I am just lining up the seams and repinning it. As you can see, that one block is a little loose, so I could have taken in the tiniest bit more on that seam, but I decided that I'm just going to ease it in, and it ends up working out just fine. So to the sewing machine now to sew these 2 rows onto the batting and the backing. I locked it in or did a back stitch as I started. I am using my walking foot on this and just taking my time and removing the pins and taking a 1/4 inch seam. And voila. So now I'm lining up row number 2. And it looks like a little needs to be taken in on that second block. And it would be nice if you could see it. There you go. And this looks much better now. Now that I have finished the quilting as you go, sewing the rows onto the batting and the back, I have it out on my cutting mat and I am evening up and cutting off the excess batting and backing. And it's finally starting to look like a wall hanging now. All I need to do is put the binding on and then sew the binding down. The finished measurement of this is 21 inches by 21.5 inches. If I wanted to, and you might want to, I could sew vertical lines on this, but I think I am just going to leave it with the horizontal lines. I think it will look fine that way. And I can always go back and change my mind and do it once the binding is on too. So that's not a big deal. Here is the binding, and I am just going to lay this on it and pin it to the corner. I have the raw edges against the raw edges of the wall hanging. I leave about 6 to 8 inches unpinned because I need to have that play for when I end it, when I finish it off, when I come to the end. And that's how it's going to look once it's done. And so let's go to the sewing machine and get the binding sewn on. I'm doing a 1/4 inch seam allowance here, and I'm still using my walking foot. If you didn't want to make a wall hanging or didn't want to have a wall hanging, you could make this as a table topper, or you could make 2 or 3 of these pieces, connect them, and have a table runner. I sew until I get to the 1/4 inch away from the end, and I am going to put the needle down into the fabric, lift up the presser foot, and pivot the fabric so that the needle faces the corner, and then run it off of the corner. Remember to put the presser foot back down. Lift the binding straight up so that there is a diagonal fold, and then fold it back down so that the fold is even with the top of the wall hanging. And then put it back under the presser foot, a 1/4 inch away from the top, and start sewing. You'll need to back stitch or tack it down. and repeat until you get back to where you started. And just like that, we're back to where we started from. So you want to leave a pretty good space that's not sewn so that you can overlap these ends. And you're going to need a ruler for this next part. You want to measure and overlap the ends to the exact same measurement that is the width of the binding. So since I have a 2.5-inch wide binding, even though it's folded, I am going to measure 2.5 inches and then cut off the end of the binding. So you want to put right sides of the fabric together perpendicular to each other. And you're going to want to watch this closely because I do it wrong. Okay, so I took that out and I am going to redo it, this time right sides facing each other, perpendicular to each other, and then sew a straight line on the diagonal, and you'll see. And voila! When it's done right, it looks fantastic. I usually hand sew the binding down on my quilts or quilt type projects, but I wanted to do this on the machine. So I am just flipping the binding over to the back, putting a pin in the ditch part because that's where I'm going to be sewing, so that I can make sure that it's going to catch on the other side. And so now I am just going to sew all around and sew that binding down. And there you have it, the fall quilt as you go wall hanging. I just love it. I am really happy with how this turned out. Thank you so much for watching. Please leave a comment and leave a thumbs up, and consider subscribing to my channel. I'd like to gain 1,000 new subscribers by the end of this year. This is how it looks over my mantle with the pumpkins that I made last year. Until next time, happy quilting. Goodbye.